Hi everyone, this is Katie McCarville. I am doing my discussion facilitation on Chapter 21, Grouping and Tracking by James Kulik. The purpose of this chapter is to provide a clear summary and analysis of research findings on grouping and tracking. There are some issues that we should discuss before we really delve into the chapter. Grouping and tracking can be somewhat confusing because people are unable to agree upon a few things. One is the definition of grouping and tracking as individual words. The second is why and how often students or schools should implement grouping and tracking. And finally, how grouping and tracking impacts students. Sort of two sides to this argument. On one side, we have what Kulik calls the detrackers, which are people who want grouping and tracking removed from all American schools. And then on the other hand, we have those who are pro grouping and tracking, and they disagree with the idea of a one-size-fits-all approach. Definition of terms. Ability grouping and tracking are two terms that have been defined in different ways throughout our history, but for the purpose of this chapter and for my presentation, I'm going to use Kulik's definitions. Ability grouping is a characteristic of any program in which school personnel use test scores or school performance to assign same grade children to groups or classes with markedly different levels of academic preparation. Tracking is used to refer to high school programs that provide students with college preparatory, vocational, or general tracks. Let's look at grouping and tracking in American schools. In high schools, it is reported that most students are being taught in homogeneous classes based on ability most of the time. In middle schools, we found that students are grouped based on ability in some subjects, but not all, so not quite as common as in high schools, but still a fairly common practice. In elementary schools, it was noted that there was a lot of within-class grouping. 90% of classes utilized within-class grouping at the primary level and 85 to 90% utilized within-class grouping at the intermediate level. But the majority of schools did group children into homogeneous classes based on skill in at least one subject. All right, let's look at some educational trends of grouping and tracking in the U.S. So in the late 1920s, we were at the height of the mental testing movement, and there was a lot of positive feelings and opinions about ability grouping. It was concluded that ability groups were effective when students were taught in ways that supported their strengths. In the 1930s, John Dewey's philosophy of progressive education sort of caused that enthusiasm for grouping to dwindle. Some believed that grouping caused undemocratic feelings between students, and it was reported that students learned less, had lower self-concepts, and lost leadership skills when they were put into ability groups. In the 1950s, we were in the middle of the Cold War, and this increased the emphasis placed on academic and scientific excellence. So there were new reports created that reported that gifted students learned more when in accelerated and enriched classes, and it was also reported that there were no negative effects on social and emotional adjustment when these advanced students were in accelerated or enriched classes. In the 1960s, we had the civil rights movement, which led to the reevaluation of groupings in schools, and the reviews of grouping at this time were reported as being very detrimental. They didn't find any positive effects of grouping. In the text, it even said that middle and lower groups suffer a loss in achievement, academic motivation, and self-esteem when in academic groups. All right, so Kulik looks at three different types of studies that evaluate different forms of grouping. The first is experimental studies. So experimental studies are defined as examining educational outcomes for equivalent students assigned to grouped and non-grouped classes. He looked at meta-analytic methods to evaluate these different types of groupings. This means that he was searching databases to find credible studies of a particular issue and then quantifying those outcomes and summarizing findings. He looked at 5 different types of groupings: XYZ programs, cross-grade programs, within-class programs, advanced and accelerated classes, and enriched classes. So let's look at the XYZ grouping first. The way that this grouping works is the top 20% students go to X class, the middle 60% of students go to Y classes, and the lowest 20% of students go to Z classes. It was designed to make the teachers' lives easier, and it was not designed as a way to provide differentiated curriculum to students at different ability levels. So even though these students were placed into classes based on ability level, they were all seeing the same curriculum. The evaluation of XYZ grouping found that lower, middle, and high ability students learned almost the same amount as students in mixed ability classrooms. What is interesting to note is that self-esteem scores went up slightly for the lowest students and down slightly for the highest students. This is thought to be because those lower students were now in classes with peers who were sort of at the same level that they were. And for the higher students, they were now in a more competitive and challenging classroom where they probably didn't stand out as much as they would have in a mixed ability group. So the overall conclusions that we can draw about XYZ grouping is that it had an insignificant impact on student learning and school improvement. Up next, we have cross-grade grouping. This is designed to provide differentiated curriculum for students with different ability levels. The Joplin plan was an example of cross-grade grouping, where children went to reading groups based on ability, not on grade level. So you had students from different grade levels all coming together to receive instruction based on their ability. It was found that more than 80% of students were positively impacted by cross-grade grouping, and the effects were positive for all ability groups, low, middle, and high, but it had an especially positive impact for the lowest students. So our overall conclusion is that cross-grade grouping had a significant impact on student learning, especially the lowest quartile of students. Up next, we have within class grouping. Teachers utilize student past performance, such as test scores, to divide their class into leveled groups, which are then taught independently using material from multiple grades. Positive results were seen in elementary and middle schools and for all ability level groups. Most students learned about 2 to 3 months more than they would have in mixed ability classes. An example of within class grouping is the TAP program. This is where students received math instruction in homogeneous and heterogeneous groups, and the results where that lower and middle ability students scored 20% above equivalent control students, and high ability students scored about the same as equivalent control students. So what we can determine from within class grouping is that it was it positively benefited student performance, especially for those low and middle ability students. Up next, we have advanced and accelerated classes. These are specifically for gifted and talented students. Evaluation studies looked at the moderate acceleration of a whole group rather than individual students, and the overall results were very positive. The students in this class, the advanced and accelerated class, were found to grow an additional year beyond similarly abled students in non-accelerated classes, and success is believed to be partially due to the curriculum differentiated implemented in these advanced and accelerated classes. So what we can conclude about these classes is that they are very beneficial for high aptitude students. Finally, we looked at enriched classes. There were some concerns about students' social and emotional needs, and this led to the implementation of enriched classes for gifted and talented students. This means that the students spent time working on curriculum content, but also on enrichment activities. Evaluation studies of enriched classes found that students achieved more in enrichment classes than in mixed ability classes, and even though their time was being split between basic learning of the content and enrichment classes, they still scored higher on standardized achievement tests than students in classes that were just focusing on those basic skills and their curriculum content. So the overall conclusion is that enriched curriculum positively impacts students by giving students varied experiences and consequently above grade level learning opportunities, which improve their basic skill knowledge. Another type of analysis that Kulik looked at is correlational analysis. And he defines this as examining performance differences in upper and lower tracks when characteristics of students selecting the tracks are statistically controlled. So this evaluation looked at high school students in curriculum tracking only. One of the questions that this aimed to answer was what factors influence students to enroll in different curricular tracks. It was found that personal preference is the most important factor, followed by academic ability. It's also interesting to note that social class and race really did not play significant roles in determining curricular tracks. The second question that was asked is how much do curricular tracks influence students? And while the results to this particular question are unclear, it is important to note that the effects of tracking on education attainment were more clear, and it was found that participation in curriculum tracking influenced educational accomplishment after high school. So for example, if a student was in a college preparatory tracking program, they're more likely to enroll in college than students who are in general tracking programs. There are a couple issues with correlational analysis. It fails to measure all the differences between high and low tracks, such as student motivation, attitude, achievement level, behavior, and prior course selection. And because researchers cannot control all of these factors, it may cause them to draw inappropriate conclusions about the tracking differences when there are other factors that are influencing the outcomes. Some of the findings is that there is a clear difference in test scores between students who completed academic tracking programs versus non-academic programs. But again, we have to note that only part of this difference is from the actual curriculum tracking, and a majority of this difference is from student selection of program tracking. Additionally, some change in achievement is related to the differentiated curriculum that is offered at the high school level. The final type of study that Kulik looked at were ethnographic studies. These studies provide narrative descriptions of classroom processes in upper and lower tracks. Oakes and her co-workers did research where they observed high school English and math classes. They looked at course content, quality of instruction, classroom climate, and student attitudes. Oakes found that in the higher tracks, the quality of the instruction was better. She found that students were on track more of the time. The students received more encouragement from the teacher for autonomous thinking, and the curriculum differed from the lower tracking courses. Gamoran and Behrens also looked at the outcomes of ethnographic studies and found that in the lower tracks, instruction was simplified and progressed more slowly. Additionally, experienced and successful teachers were disproportionately assigned to teach higher tracking courses rather than lower tracking courses. Teachers view high track students positively and low track students negatively, and they also found that students' friends are usually in the same track. There are a couple of issues with ethnographic studies. One of the important things to note is that although there were differences, those differences were very minimal, and results may be influenced by student characteristics in addition to tracking groups, and this can lead to possible misinterpretation of data. There is a quote that I want to share with you guys here that really stuck out to me in the reading. It says, "On the quality of instruction issue, the variable typically found to differentiate high and low track classes are ones that cannot be separated from the nature of students themselves. For example, many studies find there is less content covered in low track classes, but is this by its nature an indication of low quality? Might it be that low track classes need a slower pace of instruction? The whole idea of ability grouping is to provide students with a level and pace of instruction appropriate to their different needs." So even though it is reported in the ethnographic findings that the lower track tend to move at a slower pace in the curriculum that is covered is different, that may not necessarily be a bad thing. Additionally, newer ethnographic studies have found that many of those who are trying to eliminate tracking are not having very much success. Many schools that are trying to eliminate tracking are having a hard time eliminating it completely. The schools that have eliminated it completely are sometimes experiencing loss of instructional quality. Kulik said on page 278 that when untracking is achieved, it brings no guarantee of high quality instruction for everyone, but instead may bring a low level equality to all. Additionally, there is some pushback on the detracking movement from parents who really want individualized instruction for their students, and then also from higher education institutions, colleges, and universities, because they value student academic preparation and motivation that can be found in grouping and high school tracking. So for our discussion, I would like you to consider your school's approach to grouping and/or tracking. How effective do you think the grouping and tracking is for your students? Is there another form of grouping you think would be more effective? Or do you think your students would benefit from mixed ability classrooms? If so, why? Additionally, do you believe that we should continue grouping and tracking in schools, or do you think we should move to detracking schools? And why? I look forward to seeing what you all have to say. Thanks.